Wyoming Territory, 1885. The dust was a constant companion, a second skin. It settled on the brim of Ethan Blackwood's hat, coated the worn leather of his saddle, and swirled in golden phantoms across the vast, lonely expanse of his land. From the rise overlooking his ranch, he saw a world of his own making. A sturdy log house, a barn built to withstand the punishing winter winds, and neat lines of fencing that imposed a fragile order on the untamed wilderness. For 5 years, this had been his sanctuary and his prison, a place where the silence was so profound it echoed with the ghosts of laughter and a future that had turned to ash. He drew a long breath, the air sharp with the scent of pine and the coming chill of evening. His gaze drifted past his own domain toward the distant ribbon of road that led to Redemption Gulch. The town was a necessary evil, a place of noise and people, a disruption to the quiet ritual of his existence. But supplies were low, and Martha, his housekeeper and the only human being he spoke to on most days, had given him a list that was as unyielding as she was. He nudged his horse, Ajax, into a slow walk, the creak of the saddle a familiar, comforting sound. The past was a shadow that rode with him, a weight that had settled deep in his bones, and he had long ago accepted its permanence. A man survived alone. Attachments were a vulnerability, a crack in the armor that life would inevitably exploit. He had learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible, and he would not forget it. The ranch house shrank behind him, becoming a small, solitary speck in a landscape of immense, sweeping beauty and unforgiving harshness. The sky was a vast, unbroken canvas of pale blue, and the mountains on the horizon were jagged teeth against the heavens. This land demanded everything from a man: his sweat, his strength, his vigilance. It offered little in return but space. For Ethan, that had been enough. Space was silence. Space was solitude. Space was a place where he could not fail anyone again, because there was no one left to fail. Inside the house he was leaving. In a small room at the back, a layer of dust lay thick upon a small, hand-carved rocking horse. Its paint was faded, its mane of frayed rope untouched for half a decade. He never entered that room. He did not need to. The memory of it was etched behind his eyes, a constant, silent testament to the life he had lost and the vow of isolation he had made in its wake. He was 34 years old, but he felt ancient, weathered down like the granite cliffs that dominated the territory. Redemption Gulch was little more than a single, wide street carved out of the dirt, flanked by a dozen wooden buildings with false fronts that tried, and failed, to project an air of permanence. There was a saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office, a blacksmith, and a hotel whose paint was peeling like sunburnt skin. As Ethan dismounted in front of the general store, the familiar sounds of the town washed over him. The clang of a hammer on an anvil, the tinny notes of a piano from the saloon, the low murmur of conversation. It was a symphony of life that felt alien to him. He tied Ajax to the hitching post and adjusted his hat, his eyes scanning the street out of habit. He was not the law here, but years of self-reliance had honed his senses to a razor's edge. He noticed everything: the nervous twitch of a stranger's hand near his gun belt, the way a horse favored its left foreleg, the dark stain on the boardwalk that might be tobacco juice or something worse. He saw Sheriff Brody step out of his office, a solid, aging man whose presence was one of the few things in town that felt dependable. Brody gave him a slow nod, a greeting that required no words, and Ethan returned it in kind. He was halfway through his list: flour, coffee, salt, cartridges for his rifle, when he heard it. A distant, rumbling sound, punctuated by the sharp crack of a whip and the jangle of harnesses. The weekly stagecoach. Its arrival was the town's main event, a brief connection to the world beyond the mountains. Usually, Ethan made a point to be gone before it arrived, avoiding the small chaos it brought. Today, he had lingered too long. He paid the storekeeper, his movements economical and unhurried, and carried his sacks of supplies out onto the boardwalk. The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of wood and leather, thundered down the street and shuddered to a halt in a great cloud of dust. The driver, a wiry man with a face like a dried apple, tossed the reins down and spat a stream of brown juice into the dirt. A few passengers emerged, dusty and trail-worn, a pair of miners, a salesman with a weary look. Then the door opened one last time, and a woman stepped down. Ethan stopped, a sack of flour held forgotten in his hand. She was a stark, impossible contrast to everything around her. While the world of Redemption Gulch was painted in shades of brown and gray, she seemed to be made of light and color. Her hair, even pinned up and veiled beneath a smart traveling hat, was the color of warm honey. Her dress, though wrinkled and dusted with the grime of the road, was a deep sapphire blue, a shade so rich it seemed to drink the sunlight. She moved with a delicate grace that was utterly foreign here, her hand resting briefly on the coach door as she gained her footing on the uneven ground. She scanned the small assembly of onlookers, her expression a mixture of weariness and hopeful anticipation. Her eyes, he saw as she turned her head, were the color of summer sky. Then, her gaze fell upon a man stepping forward from the shadow of the saloon's awning. Silas Croft. Ethan's jaw tightened. Croft was a man of weak character and weaker prospects, known more for his presence at a poker table than at any honest work. He was dressed in a suit that was a size too big and a shade too loud, a greasy smile plastered on his face. "Miss Thompson." Croft's voice was slick with a false geniality. "Silas Croft, at your service. A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance in the flesh." The woman, Miss Thompson, offered a small, hesitant smile. "Mr. Croft, it is a relief to have arrived safely." Ethan watched, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He knew of Croft's correspondence with an Eastern woman. The whole town did. It had been a subject of gossip and speculation for months. A mail-order bride, a woman from Philadelphia, they said, answering an advertisement Croft had placed, one that surely painted him as a prosperous merchant. Looking at her now, at the refined line of her jaw and the intelligence in her eyes, Ethan felt a grim certainty. She had been deceived, utterly and completely. Croft reached for her valise, his movements too eager, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made Ethan's hand drift instinctively closer to the Colt holstered on his hip. "Let me take that for you, my dear. You must be exhausted. We'll get you settled in." Clara May Thompson felt a tremor of apprehension. The man before her was not the man from the letters. The letters had spoken of ambition, of building a respectable life, of a shared appreciation for literature and quiet evenings. The man himself smelled faintly of whiskey and desperation. His eyes, small and shifty, did not meet hers directly, but instead roamed over her as if she were a prize mare at an auction. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She held on her bag. The journey was indeed arduous. "Nonsense. A little dust never hurt anyone," he said with a dismissive wave. He tried to take her arm. "Come, my house is just this way. Simple, for now, but we'll make it a home." Clara pulled back slightly. A cold dread was beginning to seep through the exhaustion. This was a mistake. A terrible, catastrophic mistake. She had traded the sterile misery of her aunt's charity for this. For a man whose smile did not reach his eyes and whose touch she already recoiled from. "Perhaps," she began, trying to gather her thoughts. "Perhaps I might take a room at the hotel for the evening, to refresh myself." Croft's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "The hotel? What for? Your place is with me now." That was the arrangement. His voice grew louder, drawing more attention. It was then that Ethan moved. He had seen the flicker of fear in her eyes, the subtle stiffening of her spine. He had seen her recoil. It was enough. He set the sack of flour down on the boardwalk with a soft thud and walked toward them, his steps measured and silent. "Croft." Ethan's voice was low, but it cut through the air like a blade. "The lady said she wants a room at the hotel." Silas Croft turned, his face flushing with anger when he saw who had spoken. "Blackwood, this is none of your affair. This is my fiancée." Ethan's gaze flickered to Clara. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and, surprisingly, a flicker of defiance. He looked back at Croft, his expression unreadable, his presence alone a solid wall of intimidation. She doesn't look like anyone's fiancée. She looks like a woman who wants to be left alone. Now you listen here, Croft started, taking a belligerent step forward. He was emboldened by the small audience and the whiskey he had consumed while waiting. He reached out and grabbed Clara's arm, his grip tight and bruising. "She's coming with me." A small gasp escaped Clara's lips. It was the sound that broke Ethan's restraint. He moved with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He did not draw his weapon. He did not need to. He simply took hold of Croft's wrist, his fingers wrapping around it like a band of iron. Croft cried out, his fingers going limp, releasing Clara's arm. Ethan applied a slight, almost casual pressure, and Croft's face went white with pain. "I believe," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout, "that you were just leaving." He released Croft's wrist with a small shove. Humiliated and furious, Croft stumbled backward. He shot a venomous glare at Ethan, then at Clara. "You'll regret this. Both of you," he snarled, before turning and scurrying back toward the saloon like a kicked dog. The sudden silence was deafening. The small crowd of onlookers began to disperse, sensing the drama was over. Clara stood frozen, her hand covering the red marks on her arm. Her entire world had just tilted on its axis. She was alone, thousands of miles from anything she knew, with no money, no plan, and a newly acquired enemy. She swayed, the dust, the heat, and the overwhelming shock finally catching up to her. The world swam before her eyes, the edges darkening. She stumbled. Before she could fall, strong hands caught her. She found herself pressed against a chest as solid as an oak tree, an arm wrapped securely around her waist. She smelled the clean, sharp scent of pine, of leather, and of the dust of the plains. She looked up into the face of the man who had rescued her. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were filled with a guarded, assessing expression. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the rugged landscape around them. It was a face that held a deep, quiet sorrow. For a long moment, they remained like that, a tableau of unexpected intimacy in the middle of a dusty street. Her hand rested on his forearm, and she could feel the rigid strength of the muscle beneath his sleeve. He was holding her as if she were something precious, yet his expression remained distant, almost wary. The connection was immediate, a spark of electricity in the desolate air. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was over. He gently set her back on her feet, though his hand remained on her elbow to steady her. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked. His voice, stripped of its earlier menace, was a deep, rumbling baritone. Clara took a shaky breath, tried to regain her composure. She was a Thompson. Her father had been a professor of classics. She was not the sort of woman to faint in the street. "Yes," she managed, her voice a little breathless. "Yes, I am. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," he supplied, his gaze already drifting away, as if regretting his involvement. Ethan Blackwood. It was at that moment that a new voice joined them, practical and firm. "Well, I should say so." Standing up to that good-for-nothing Silas Croft, Martha, Ethan's housekeeper, bustled over from the general store, a basket on her arm and a look of shrewd appraisal on her face. She had seen the whole thing from the doorway. "Ethan, you can't just leave the poor girl standing in the street. She's had a terrible shock." Ethan looked as though he would rather face a grizzly bear than this situation. People. Complications. He had ridden into town to avoid them, not to collect them. She said she wanted a room at the hotel, he stated, his tone flat and practical. Martha snorted, a sound of pure derision. The hotel? That flea-bitten establishment run by a man who cheats at solitaire? And with Croft likely to come stumbling back, full of saloon courage? "Don't be a fool." She turned her sharp but not unkind eyes on Clara. "You'll come with us, child. Our ranch is a few miles out of town. It's quiet and safe. You can stay with us until you decide what's to be done." Clara was taken aback. The offer was generous to a fault, but she was hesitant to impose. "I couldn't possibly. You've already done so much." "Nonsense." Martha declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Ethan has a whole house and only uses a corner of it. I'm the housekeeper, Martha. You'll be perfectly safe and properly chaperoned. Isn't that right, Ethan?" She shot him a look that dared him to contradict her. Ethan's jaw was set in a hard line. This was precisely the kind of entanglement he had structured his entire life to avoid. A woman in his house. A woman with sky-blue eyes and a quiet strength that he had seen even in her fear. A woman who was trouble, not of her own making, but trouble all the same. He felt the familiar walls of his solitude being breached, and his every instinct screamed at him to retreat. But he could not leave her here. He had seen the predator in Croft's eyes, and he knew the man would not be so easily deterred. To leave her in town would be to abandon her to a fate she did not deserve. The code he lived by, a remnant of an older, more honorable self, would not permit it. He gave a short, reluctant nod. "Martha's right. It's safer for you at the ranch." He turned and picked up his sacks of supplies as if the matter was settled. "We'll get you things." And so, Clara Mae Thompson, who had traveled 2,000 miles to become a bride, found herself instead climbing into a rugged buckboard wagon next to a stern, silent rancher and his formidable housekeeper, heading toward a future that was a complete and terrifying blank. As the wagon rattled out of Redemption Gulch, she glanced back at the dusty street. She did not feel regret for the life she had just narrowly escaped. She felt only a profound and unsettling uncertainty and a strange, illogical sense of safety in the presence of the wounded loner beside her. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of violet and rose, and the vast, empty land seemed to yawn before them, ready to swallow her whole. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was made largely in silence. The rhythmic clatter of the wagon wheels and the soft snort of the horses were the only sounds, save for an occasional practical comment from Martha about the chill in the air. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his profile rigid and unapproachable. Clara sat between him and Martha, acutely aware of the space he maintained between them, a deliberate, measured distance. She studied his hands on the reins, large, calloused, and capable. They were the hands that had saved her, the hands that had held her with such surprising steadiness. As they crested a final hill, the ranch came into view, nestled in a shallow valley. It was just as she had seen it from a distance, a fortress of solitude. The log house was dark against the deepening twilight, a single plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It looked sturdy, safe, and profoundly lonely. It was a reflection of the man who drove the wagon. "Here we are," Martha announced with a note of satisfaction. "Oh." Ethan brought the wagon to a halt near the porch. He swung down with an athletic grace and turned to help Clara. He reached up, and for the second time that day, his hands were on her. He spanned her waist easily, lifting her down to the ground as if she weighed nothing. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it sent another jolt through her. For an instant, his gray eyes met hers in the dim light, and she saw something flicker in their depths, something more than just caution. Then it was gone, shuddered away. "Martha will show you to your room," he said, his voice clipped and formal. He turned away to unhitch the horses, his broad back a clear dismissal. The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. A fire crackled in the large stone hearth, casting a welcoming glow over a room that was simple, masculine, and impeccably clean. A long wooden table was flanked by benches. A few comfortable-looking armchairs were pulled near the fire, and shelves filled with books lined one wall. It was a space built for function, not comfort, yet Martha's presence had softened the edges. "He's not much for talking," Martha said quietly as she led Clara up a narrow wooden staircase. "Hasn't been for a long time. Don't take it personally, child." The room she was given was small and spare, but clean. It held a simple bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a small window that looked out over the vast, dark plains. It was a nun's cell, but after the ordeal of her journey and the horror in town, it felt like a palace. I don't know how to thank you," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. Martha patted her arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. There's no need for thanks. You were in a bad spot. We do what's right. Now, you get yourself cleaned up. Supper will be on the table in half an hour. Supper was a tense, quiet affair. Ethan sat at the head of the table, eating with an efficient focus that discouraged conversation. Clara, trying to bridge the chasm of silence, commented on the quality of the stew. It's delicious, Martha. Thank you. Beef and barley. Fills a man up, Martha replied, glancing at Ethan, who offered no response. Clara tried again, directing her question to him. Your ranch is very beautiful, Mr. Blackwood. How long have you lived here? Ethan looked up, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. He seemed surprised to be addressed directly. 5 years, he answered. The 2 words were delivered like a final statement. Undeterred, Clara pressed on, driven by a need to understand the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. Did you build it yourself? A flicker of something, pride perhaps, or just the memory of hard work, crossed his face. Most of it. The conversation died there. After the meal, Ethan retreated to one of the armchairs with a ledger book, his focus absolute. He was building a wall of work and silence around himself, a wall Clara was beginning to understand was his natural habitat. Martha clattered dishes in the kitchen, and Clara, feeling useless, sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance. The warmth felt good, but it did little to chase away the chill of her uncertainty. Later, after Martha had retired for the night, Ethan finally closed his ledger. He stood and added another log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He did not look at her, but he did not immediately leave, either. He stood with his back to her, one hand resting on the stone mantelpiece. You should not have come west, Miss Thompson, he said, his voice low and gravelly. This is no place for a woman like you. The words stung, not because they were unkind, but because they echoed her own fears. Yet, something in her bristled at the assumption. A woman like me? And what kind of woman is that, Mr. Blackwood? He turned then, his gray eyes pinning her. A woman who belongs in a place with paved streets and libraries. A woman who is not accustomed to deception and hardship. My father was a professor, she said softly, her gaze on the fire. He taught me that hardship is a part of the human condition, not a geographical location. And he taught me to read Greek. It does not, however, prepare one for a world without him. Or my mother, she had not intended to say it, but the loneliness of the past year was a raw wound, and his quiet presence seemed to draw the truth from her. They died of influenza last winter. I found myself alone, with few options. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty, but filled with a sudden, shared understanding. Ethan's posture softened almost imperceptibly. He knew that word. Alone. It was the bedrock of his own existence. He looked at the fire, his jaw working for a moment before he spoke. His voice was rougher now, freighted with a weight she could only guess at. I had a family. Once, he said the words to the flames, not to her. A wife, Anna, and a son, Jacob. Clara held her breath. She could feel the immense effort the confession cost him. It was the fever, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. 5 years ago. It took them both in less than a week. I built this house for them. For us, he finally looked at her, and the sorrow in his eyes was so vast and deep it was like looking into a winter sea. I learned then that the things you build can be taken away. The people you love, they can be taken away. It's better to have nothing to lose. In that moment, he was no longer the intimidating stranger or the silent rancher. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a man who had tried to cauterize his own heart against further pain. Clara's own loss, as sharp as it was, seemed to pale in comparison to the utter desolation in his voice. I am so sorry, Mr. Blackwood, she whispered. The formality of his name felt absurd now. I'm so very sorry for your loss. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if to ward off any further sympathy. He had shared more of himself in those few sentences than he had with anyone in 5 years, and the exposure clearly made him uncomfortable. My housekeeper is a good woman, but she believes problems can be fixed by company and hot meals, he said, his tone shifting back toward the practical. She is mistaken, but you are safe here. Croft will not trouble you. He turned and walked to the staircase. Good night, Miss Thompson. Clara watched him go. The wall was back up, the shutters drawn. But she had seen behind it. She had seen the wounded man hiding in the fortress of his own making. And she understood now that his silence was not a rejection of her, but a defense against a world that had already cost him everything. Lying in the small, clean bed, she listened to the sound of the wind sighing around the corners of the house. It no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a lament. The following days fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Clara, unwilling to be a helpless guest, insisted on helping Martha. To the housekeeper's surprise and Ethan's silent observation, she was a quick and diligent learner. She kneaded bread with flour, dusting her fine dress, her movements becoming more confident each day. She learned to milk the cow, her initial squeamishness giving way to a quiet pride in the accomplishment. She was not a delicate thing. She was resilient. She was a survivor, just like him, though her scars were different. Ethan watched her from a distance. He saw her talking to his horses, her voice soft and gentle. He saw her sitting on the porch in the evenings, a book from his shelves open in her lap, her expression thoughtful. She was bringing life and light into the corners of his world that had been dark for so long. The scent of lavender, faint and clean, clung to the linens she washed. The sound of her humming a soft tune as she worked in the garden was a melody that worked its way under his skin. He was a man stranded in a desert, and she was the promise of rain. It terrified him. He grew more terse, more distant, retreating further into his work. He would leave before sunrise and return after sunset, his face grim with fatigue. He was trying to exhaust the feeling out of himself, to build the walls of his solitude higher and thicker. But it was no use. Her presence was a fact, an undeniable warmth in the cold emptiness of his house. He began to see her strength. One afternoon, a young calf got itself tangled in a stretch of wire fence. Ethan was in the far pasture, too distant to hear its panicked bleating. It was Clara who heard it. Without hesitation, she ran out, her skirts catching on the scrub brush. She soothed the terrified animal with her voice, her hands gentle on its trembling hide, while she worked patiently to free its leg. By the time Ethan rode up, drawn by the commotion, she had already freed the calf and was stroking its neck as it shakily got to its feet. She had a long scratch on her arm and her dress was torn, but her face was flushed with success. She looked up at him, her blue eyes bright. He's all right, just frightened. Ethan stared at her, at the dirt on her cheek and the genuine compassion in her expression. He had misjudged her completely. She was not a fragile piece of porcelain from the East. She was made of something far stronger, steel wrapped in silk. He dismounted and walked over, his eyes going to the scratch on her arm. "You're hurt," he said, his voice gruff. "It is nothing," she dismissed, though it was bleeding freely. Without a word, he tore a strip of cloth from a clean rag in his saddlebag. He took her arm gently, his callous thumb brushing against her skin as he inspected the wound. The touch was electric, a sudden, shocking current that made her breath catch. He wrapped the cloth around her arm, his movements deft and sure. His head was bent, his focus entirely on the task, and for a moment, Clara had the absurd desire to reach out and touch his dark, unruly hair. "Thank you," she whispered. He finished the knot and released her, stepping back as if burned. "You should have waited for me," he said, but the words lacked their usual sharp edge. There was a new emotion in his voice, something that sounded almost like admiration. He had spent 5 years believing he needed no one. But in that moment, watching her care for one of his animals, seeing the quiet competence in her hands, he felt a grudging respect that was dangerously close to something more. She did not just occupy his house. She was becoming a part of the life of the ranch itself. She belonged here in a way he could never have anticipated, and that thought was the most perilous one of all. The fragile piece of the ranch was not destined to last. Silas Croft had been humiliated, and his wounded pride, stoked by the whispers of the man he owed money to, festered into a need for revenge. Bartholomew Corbin, the wealthy and ruthless cattle baron who owned the vast lands to the south, had been the one to secretly finance Croft's advertisement for a bride. Corbin's ambition was limitless. He wanted control of the valley and Ethan Blackwood's ranch, with its access to the deep and reliable Crystal Creek, was the key. Corbin had hoped to use Croft's marriage to a naive Easterner as leverage to somehow entangle the water rights. Blackwood's interference had ruined that simple plan. Now, a more direct approach was required. The first sign of trouble came a week after Clara's arrival. Ethan and Clara were walking the fence line near the creek, a task Ethan had grudgingly allowed her to join him on. The silence between them had become more comfortable, punctuated by her questions about the land and his short, practical answers. He found himself explaining the habits of the antelope, the names of the wildflowers, the way the clouds foretold the weather. He was talking more than he had in years. They found it near the northern pasture. A section of his fence had been cut, not broken by a stray steer, but deliberately snipped with wire cutters. 3 clean cuts. It was a message. Ethan's face hardened, the brief softness of the morning erased. He knelt, examining the wire. This was done last night. Who would do this? Clara asked, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Someone who wants to make a point, he said, his gray eyes scanning the surrounding hills. Someone letting me know they can get to my property. To my stock. He stood, his whole body tense. The peace he had so carefully constructed was being threatened, and it was because of her. The thought was immediate and brutal. Before she arrived, his world was quiet. Now, the wolves were circling. This is because of me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Because of what happened in town with Mr. Croft. Ethan did not deny it. He couldn't. Croft doesn't have the spine to do this himself. Someone's backing him. He started walking back toward the house, his strides long and angry. You need to make arrangements to go back east. As soon as possible. The words were like a slap. After these days of shared work, of quiet understanding, of the unspoken bond that had been growing between them, he was casting her out. Go back, she repeated, hurrying to keep up. Go back to what? A life of charity in my aunt's house? To be a burden and a reminder of her sister's unfortunate daughter. It's better than being here, he bit out, his anger a shield for the fear coiling inside him. Fear for her. This is my fight. I won't have you in the middle of it. I'm already in the middle of it, she argued, her voice rising with a passion that surprised them both. Do you think Croft and his sponsor will simply forget about me if I leave? They will see it as a victory. They will see you as weak, and they will push harder. He stopped and turned on her, his face a thunderous mask. I'm not weak, he growled, his voice dangerously low. And I will not have my decisions questioned. I have kept myself safe here for 5 years by staying apart from other people's trouble. You brought it to my door. The accusation, raw and unfair, struck her to the core. Tears of frustration and hurt pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, her blue eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. I may have been naive, Mr. Blackwood. I may have made a terrible mistake in coming here. But I am not trouble. I am a person. And I will not be shipped off like a piece of unwanted luggage because you are afraid. I am not afraid, he lied, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He was terrified. He was terrified of the violence that was coming, but more than that, he was terrified of what he would feel if that violence touched her. It was the old pain, the old loss, rising up like a specter. He had to get her away. He had to restore the sterile safety of his solitude. Before he could retort, Martha's voice rang out from the porch. Ethan, Sheriff Brody is here. The sheriff was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked grave. Ethan, Martha told me about your guest. Figured I should ride out, he nodded at Clara. Mom, what has it been? Ethan asked, his tone still sharp. Couple of hard-looking strangers rode into town yesterday, Brody said, getting straight to the point. Asking questions. Asked about Silas Croft. Asked about the woman he was supposed to marry. Then they rode south, toward Corbin's spread. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Corbin, it made a sick kind of sense. Bartholomew Corbin was a cancer on the territory, buying up small ranches, controlling water, bending the law to his will. My guess is Corbin was backing Croft's little mail-order scheme, Brody continued, hoping to get a hook into you through a pliable new wife and some legal nonsense about her dowry being tied to your water rights. When you stepped in, you spoiled his game. Corbin doesn't like his games being spoiled. The pieces clicked into place. This was no longer about Croft's wounded pride. It was about land and water and greed. It was about a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And Clara was caught in the crossfire. So the cut fence, Ethan began. Was a warning, Brody finished. Corbin's way of telling you he's still in the game. He'll be back. He'll try to run her off, or run you off. Or worse. The sheriff looked from Ethan's grim face to Clara's pale one. You need to be careful, Ethan. Both of you. After the sheriff left, a heavy silence descended on the house. The external threat was no longer a suspicion. It had a name and a face. Ethan felt cornered. His instinct was to fight, to meet the threat head-on, but the thought of Clara being in the line of fire paralyzed him. That night, sleep offered no escape. He was haunted by dreams of fire and fever, the memory of Anna's fading smile, the weight of his son's small, still body in his arms. He woke up in a cold sweat, the old grief clawing at him, fresh and raw. He could not go through that again. He would not. The decision solidified in his mind, as hard and cold as iron. He had to protect her, and the only way to do that was to send her away. It was a cruel necessity, a surgical amputation to prevent a mortal wound. The next day, he was a man of ice. He avoided her, his silence a palpable force field. He spent the day reinforcing the barn door and checking the mechanisms of his rifle and shotgun, his movements precise and deadly. Clara watched him, her heart aching. The brief camaraderie they had shared was gone, replaced by this cold, terrifying resolve. The escalation came sooner than any of them expected. 2 nights later, a storm rolled in, the sky bruised and purple, the wind howling like a hungry wolf. In the midst of the tempest, a new sound broke the rhythm of the rain and thunder, the frantic, terrified whinnying of horses. The barn, Ethan shouted, grabbing a lantern and his shotgun. He burst out into the storm, Clara and Martha right behind him. The main door of the barn was swinging wildly in the wind. Someone had unlatched it. Inside, the horses were panicked, their eyes wide with terror. In the flickering lantern light, they saw the cause. A small fire had been set in a pile of hay at the far end of the barn. The flames were already licking up the dry wooden walls. Martha, get the water buckets. Clara, help me with the horses. Ethan commanded, his voice a sharp crack of authority over the storm's roar. There was no time for fear. Adrenaline surged through Clara. While Ethan fought the panicked stallion, Ajax, she went to the mare, Daisy, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice, the way she had with the calf. Easy now, easy girl. It's all right. We're going to get you out. The smoke was thick, acrid. It stung her eyes and clawed at her throat. But she kept her voice steady, her hand firm on the mare's halter. She led the trembling animal out into the lashing rain, away from the burning barn. She turned back to see Ethan wrestling with Ajax, the powerful horse rearing in terror. A burning beam crashed down from the loft, landing only feet from them. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a hook near the door, plunged it into the rain barrel until it was soaked, and ran back inside. "Ethan!" she screamed, throwing the heavy, wet blanket over a patch of spreading flames near the door, creating a path. Her action broke the horse's panic just enough. Ethan gave a final, mighty heave on the reins, and Ajax bolted through the opening, galloping out into the storm-swept yard. Ethan followed, his face black with soot, coughing from the smoke. He stumbled to a stop and saw Clara, her face pale, her dress soaked and smudged, standing her ground with the mare's reins in her hand. Martha was already throwing buckets of water onto the flames with grim efficiency. Together, the three of them fought the fire. They were a small, desperate brigade against the destructive force. They passed buckets, beat at the flames with wet sacks, and choked on the smoke until, finally, aided by the drenching rain, the fire subsided, leaving a blackened, smoldering hole in the side of the barn and the stink of wet ash. They stood in the rain, exhausted, soaked to the bone, and breathing in ragged gasps. Ethan looked at the damage, then he looked at Clara. She had not screamed. She had not panicked. She had run toward the danger, not away from it. She had risked her own life to help him, to save his horses, to save his barn, his home. A wave of emotion so powerful it staggered him, crashed over him. It was not just respect. It was not just admiration. It was a fierce, terrifying protectiveness, a feeling he had sworn he would never allow himself to experience again. He looked at her, standing there in the rain, a smudge of soot on her cheek, her blue eyes wide and luminous in the darkness, and he knew he was lost. The fortress he had built around his heart had been breached, not by force, but by the quiet courage of this woman from Philadelphia. He walked over to her, his steps heavy. He reached out and brushed the soot from her cheek with his thumb, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You are a fool," he said, his voice rough with smoke and an emotion he could not name. "And you are a stubborn, proud man," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He let his hand fall, the brief contact leaving a trail of fire on her skin. The sight of her in danger, the acrid smell of the burning hay, had resurrected his deepest fears with a vengeance. This feeling, this terrifying warmth spreading through his chest, was a precursor to pain. He had to stop it. He had to sever it, no matter the cost. "This ends now," he said, his voice turning to ice. "Tomorrow, I am taking you to Cheyenne. I will buy you a train ticket to wherever you want to go. You will not stay here another day." He turned and strode toward the house, leaving her standing alone in the rain, the cold of his words more chilling than the storm itself. The morning after the fire dawned cold and unervingly clear. The sky was washed clean, and the air held the crisp, clean scent of rain-soaked earth. But inside the ranch house, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words and glacial tension. Ethan had been true to his word. He had packed a small saddlebag, his movements stiff and deliberate. He had counted out a thick wad of bills from the metal box he kept hidden under a floorboard, more than enough for a train ticket and expenses. Clara watched him from the kitchen doorway, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. He was shutting her out completely. The man who had shared his deepest loss with her by the fire, the man whose hand had been so gentle on her cheek in the aftermath of the fire, was gone. In his place was this stranger, this remote, unyielding jailer intent on her exile. She understood his fear. She had seen it in his eyes, the raw terror of losing someone again. But she could not accept that his fear should be allowed to dictate her life, to erase the fragile, beautiful thing that had begun to grow between them. Martha, her face a mask of disapproval, slammed a pot down on the stove. "You're a fool, Ethan Blackwood," she said, her voice low and sharp. "A blind, stubborn fool. Can't you see what you're throwing away?" Ethan didn't look at her. He didn't look at Clara. He stared out the window at the damaged barn, his jaw set like granite. "I'm keeping her safe. It's the only thing that matters." "Safe?" Martha scoffed. "You're sending her back to a life of misery to soothe your own ghosts. That isn't safety, that's cowardice. You're so afraid of the past repeating itself that you're destroying any chance of a future." His shoulders tensed, but he remained silent. He pulled on his coat and picked up his hat. It was time. He had to do this. He had to cut her out of his life like a surgeon removing a tumor. It would hurt, but he would survive. He always survived. Solitude was his armor. He finally turned, his gray eyes sweeping past Martha to land on Clara. His expression was shuttered, unreadable. "The wagon is ready. Get your things." Clara did not move. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering. The tears she had fought back last night were gone, replaced by a calm, resolute strength. She had spent the night staring into the darkness, contemplating her options. She could go, accept his money, and return to the slow, suffocating emptiness of her old life. Or she could fight. For the first time in her life, she was going to fight for what she wanted. And what she wanted was here, in this wild, beautiful, dangerous land, with this broken, courageous, impossible man. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it resonated in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. Ethan's composure finally cracked. A muscle jumped in his jaw. What did you say? I said no, she repeated, taking a step forward. I will not be sent away. This is my home now, as much as it is yours. I helped save it last night. I have worked in it, bled for it. You do not get to make this decision for me. I'm trying to protect you, he exploded, his voice raw with a pain he could no longer conceal. Don't you understand? Corbin, his men, they will not stop. They tried to burn us out last night. What do you think they will do next? I will not stand by and watch you get hurt. I will not bury anyone else on this land. The confession hung in the air between them, a cry of pure agony. He had finally admitted the truth of his terror. Clara's heart broke for him, but she did not yield. And I will not run away and leave you to face them alone. What do you think that would do to me, Ethan? To spend the rest of my life wondering if you were safe? Wondering if you were even alive? You talk of safety, but some things are worse than dying. Living as a coward is one of them. Living without the things that matter, is another. She took another step, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him. She could see the storm in his eyes, the war between his fear and his heart. She reached out, not to touch him, but as a plea. I'm not your first wife, Ethan, she said, her voice dropping to an intense, earnest whisper. I'm not Anna. I'm Clara, and my fate is my own to choose. I choose to stay. I choose to fight beside you. He stared at her, his breathing ragged. Everything she said was a direct assault on the creed he had lived by for 5 years. She was tearing down his walls brick by brick, and he did not know how to stop her. He felt a desperate urge to pull her into his arms, to hold her and never let go. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all. It was the feeling that had preceded the fall. He took a step back, breaking the connection, the air rushing back into the space between them. The retreat was instinctual, a reflexive recoil from the warmth of a fire he knew could burn him. He had to get away to think. The confines of the house were suffocating him. I'm riding to Cheyenne, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion once more. He was rebuilding the wall, stone by cold stone. I will talk to the territorial marshal. I will arrange for your safe passage. When I get back, you'll be ready to leave. He turned his back on her and walked toward the door. He was not taking the wagon. He was taking Ajax, his fastest horse. He was fleeing. Clara watched him go, a cold dread washing over her. He was not just riding to Cheyenne. He was riding away from her, away from the feelings she had unearthed in him. He was choosing solitude. He was choosing the ghosts of his past over the possibility of a future. He was on the porch, his hand on the railing, when her voice stopped him. It was not loud, not pleading. It was a statement of fact, as calm and final as a judge's sentence. Ethan, he paused, but did not turn. If you ride away tonight, you won't find me here tomorrow. The words struck him with physical force. He froze, his back ramrod straight. It was an ultimatum, a choice. Her or his solitude. Her or his fear. He did not know what she meant by it. Would she leave on her own? Would she face Corbin herself? The ambiguity of it was a knife in his gut. For a long, agonizing moment, he stood there caught between two worlds. The world of grief and safety he had built, and the world of terrifying, brilliant light she offered. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then, without a word, without a backward glance, he continued down the steps and swung himself into the saddle. He spurred Ajax into a gallop, riding away from the house, away from her, as if the devil himself were on his heels. Clara watched him disappear over the rise, the sound of the hoofbeats fading into the vast silence of the prairie. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She had laid her heart bare, and he had ridden away. Martha came and stood beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. He'll be back, the older woman said softly. No, Clara whispered, her voice hollow. He won't. She believed he had made his choice. and now she had to make hers. Ethan rode like a man possessed. The wind whipped at his face, and Ajax's powerful strides ate up the miles, but he could not outrun her words. "If you ride away tonight, you won't find me here tomorrow." They echoed in his head with the rhythm of the horse's hooves. A promise, a threat, a choice. He told himself he was doing the right thing. The only thing. He was riding for the law, for a solution that did not involve more violence at his doorstep. He was riding to save her. But the justification rang hollow, a lie he told himself to mask the truth. He was running. He was running from the terror of her courage, from the hope she ignited in him, from the love he felt blooming in the barren wasteland of his heart. Love was a prelude to loss. He knew this. He had lived it. Miles fell away beneath him. The sun climbed higher in the sky. He stopped once at a creek to water Ajax, his movements mechanical. He looked at his reflection in the clear, cold water. The face that stared back was that of a stranger, a haunted, desperate man. The face of coward. Martha's word. It stung with the venom of truth. He thought of Clara standing in the doorway, her chin held high, her eyes full of a strength that shamed him. "I choose to stay. I choose to fight beside you." No one had ever said that to him. Anna had been soft and gentle, a creature of light he had sought to protect from the world's harshness. But Clara was a warrior in her own right. She was not asking for protection. She was offering an alliance, a partnership, and he had thrown it back in her face. "You won't find me here tomorrow." What did she mean? Would she take one of the other horses and ride out on her own into this dangerous land? The thought sent a spear of ice-cold fear through him. She was brave, but she did not know the territory, the men in it. Or worse, would she stay? Would she stay and face Corbin alone, out of sheer, stubborn pride? Would he return to find? He could not finish the thought. The image of the ranch, silent and smoking, of her lying. No. He shut his eyes, the vision so vivid it made him physically sick. He had left her there. He had left her and Martha, two women alone, in a house that had already been attacked once. He had done it in the name of protecting her, but his actions had put her in more danger than ever. Corbin's spies would have seen him leave. They would assume the ranch was undefended. They would see it as an invitation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had not been thinking clearly. He had been blinded by panic, by the ghosts of his past. He had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He looked down the road, toward the distant promise of Cheyenne and the law. It was hours away, too far. Anything could happen in that time. Then he looked back over his shoulder in the direction of the ranch, in the direction of Clara. There was no choice. There never had been. With a muttered curse at his own foolishness, he wrenched Ajax's reins, turning the powerful horse in a tight circle. "Come on, boy," he urged, his voice tight with desperation. "Hiya!" He dug his heels in, and the horse surged forward, galloping back the way they had come. Back toward the ranch. Back toward her. He was no longer running away. He was riding toward the fight. He was riding to save his future, and he prayed to a God he no longer believed in that he was not too late. Back at the ranch, a grim resolve had settled over the two women. After Ethan's departure, Clara had not wept. Her brief moment of despair had crystallized into a cold, hard anger. He had abandoned them. Very well. They would not be helpless victims. "Martha," she said, her voice steady. "Mr. Blackwood showed me how to load the shotgun. Is there another rifle in the house?" Martha looked at her, a glimmer of fierce pride in her old eyes. "In the study. His father's old Winchester. It's clean and it's loaded," she nodded. "Corbin's men will have seen him ride out. They'll think we're easy pickings. They'll likely wait for dusk." They spent the afternoon preparing for a siege. They barred the windows, wedging heavy furniture against the doors. They brought buckets of water inside, not for drinking, but for fires. Clara found the Winchester, the cool weight of the steel, and what unfamiliar but reassuring in her hands. Martha checked the loads in the shotgun Ethan had left behind. They were two women, alone, against a gang of ruthless men, but they were not afraid. They were determined. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and red. They saw them. 4 riders, silhouetted against the dying light, approaching the ranch not from the road, but from the south, from the direction of Corbin's land. "They're here," Martha said, her voice grim. Clara took her position at the front window, the long barrel of the Winchester resting on the sill. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She thought of Ethan. She hated him for leaving, but she also prayed for him to be safe. And she prayed that she could live up to the strength he had, for a fleeting moment, seen in her. The riders fanned out, circling the house. One of them, a big, bearded man with cruel eyes, trotted his horse forward. It was not Corbin himself. He was too important for that. These were his dogs. "Hello, the house," the man yelled. "We know you're in there, ladies. Mr. Corbin just wants to talk to the pretty one. Send her out, and we'll leave the rest of you in peace." Martha, positioned at a side window with a shotgun, let out a derisive snort. "Peace comes after a man's buried," she muttered. "Go away," Clara shouted, her voice clearer and stronger than she'd expected. "There's nothing for you here." The man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, I think there is. We saw your man ride out this morning. He ain't coming back for you. He left you. Now, you can come out easy, or we can burn you out for real this time." That was it. The final confirmation of Ethan's abandonment in the eyes of his enemies. A cold fury settled over Clara. She sighted down the barrel of the Winchester, aiming not at the man, but at the ground just in front of his horse. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Outside, dirt erupted at the horse's feet. The animal shrieked and reared, nearly unseating the rider. The man fought his horse under control, his face contorted with rage. "Fine, have it your way, bitch," he roared to his men. "Light it up." 2 of the men dismounted, carrying torches that they had already lit. They ran toward the house, aiming for the porch and the dry wood of the walls. "Now, Martha," Clara yelled. From a side window, the shotgun boomed. Martha had aimed low, at the legs of the closest man. He screamed and dropped his torch, clutching a leg shredded by buckshot. The second man hesitated, looking back at his leader. It was in that moment of hesitation that a new sound joined the fray, the thunder of a lone horse galloping at full speed. Ethan crested the rise just as the first shot was fired. He saw the torches, the men circling his house, and a primal rage, cold and absolute, washed over him. He had been right. He had been a fool. He let out a wordless yell that was part animal roar, part battle cry, and drew his Colt. The men, startled by the sudden appearance of the rider they thought was miles away, turned in confusion. The leader's eyes widened in shock. Blackwood. Ethan did not slow down. He rode directly at them, firing from the saddle. His first shot caught the second torchbearer in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second took the leader's horse out from under him. The man crashed to the ground as Ethan galloped past. He leaped from Ajax's back before the horse had even come to a full stop, using the animal for cover as he landed in a crouch, his rifle now in his hands. The fourth man, still mounted, raised his own rifle. But before he could fire, a shot rang out from the house. The man grunted, dropping his weapon and clutching his arm. Clara! She had fired again. The downed leader scrambled for his pistol. Ethan was faster. He sighted down his rifle and fired. The shot was clean, final. The man fell back and lay still. The wounded man on the ground was trying to crawl away. The one Ethan had shot in the shoulder was already on his horse and fleeing for his life. It was over in less than a minute. A whirlwind of controlled, deadly violence. The silence that fell was shocking, broken only by the groans of the man Martha had shot and the heavy, ragged sound of Ethan's own breathing. He stood there, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the yard, ensuring there were no more threats. Then his gaze locked on the house. The front door creaked open. Clara stood in the doorway, the Winchester still clutched in her hands. Her face was pale, her hair had come loose from its pins, but her eyes were blazing. She was magnificent. She was alive. The rifle slipped from Ethan's numb fingers, clattering into the dirt. He He took a step toward her, then another. He broke into a run, crossing the yard in a few desperate strides. He didn't stop until he reached the porch, until he was standing in front of her. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. The words were choked in his throat. He simply reached out and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, of smoke and lavender and life. He held her with a desperate strength, as if he could physically fuse her to him, ensuring she could never be taken away. She was stiff in his arms for only a second, then she sagged against him, the rifle falling from her grasp. Her arms went around his neck, and she clung to him, her body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. "You came back," she whispered into his shoulder, her voice breaking. "I was a fool to leave," he choked out, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "A goddamn fool. I heard your words all the way to Willow Creek. I turned around. I was so afraid I'd be too late." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. His gray eyes, stripped of all their walls, were raw with love and fear and a profound, bone-deep relief. "Clara," he breathed her name like a prayer. "When I saw those torches, when I thought they might have hurt you, I realized that a life without you isn't solitude. It's just empty. It's nothing. I love you. I love you, and I was so afraid of that love that I almost destroyed us both." The confession, torn from the deepest part of him in the aftermath of violence and fear, was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever heard. Tears finally streamed down her face, tears of relief, of joy. "Oh, Ethan," she sobbed, a laugh catching in her throat. "I love you too. You stubborn, proud, wonderful man." He let out a shuddering breath, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and homecoming, of promises made and futures claimed. It was fierce and deep and absolute, a sealing of the bond that had been forged in fire and fear. It tasted of gunpowder and rain and the undeniable certainty of home. In the yard, the wounded man groaned, reminding them of the world outside their embrace. But for that one perfect moment, nothing else existed. He had ridden away, but he had come back, and she was still there. In the immediate aftermath, a sense of surreal calm settled over the ranch. Sheriff Brody, having been alerted by the fleeing rider, arrived with a posse of 2 deputized townsmen just as dusk fully surrendered to darkness. They found a scene of quiet order. The wounded men had been tied up, their injuries crudely but effectively bandaged by Martha. The body of the man Ethan had shot lay covered by a blanket. Brody took in the scene with a slow, assessing gaze, the damage to the house, the spent cartridges littering the yard, and the way Ethan stood protectively beside Clara, his hand never leaving the small of her back. "Looks like you handled it, Ethan," the sheriff said, his voice laced with understatement. "We handled it," Ethan corrected, his eyes finding Clara's. The "we" was new, a word that felt more right than any he had spoken in 5 years. The posse took the prisoners, including the man who had fled but was caught on the road, and the body of the dead man, back to Redemption Gulch. The charges would be attempted murder and arson. The testimony of the prisoners would be enough to issue a warrant for Bartholomew Corbin. His reign of terror was over. When they were gone, an immense silence fell once more upon the ranch, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and the stark reality of what had happened. They had faced death and survived. Martha, ever practical, lit the lamps in the house and put a kettle on the stove. "You two look like you've been dragged through hell backwards," she announced. "Seat. I'll make tea." But Ethan didn't move toward the table. He turned to Clara in the warm lamplight, his expression deeply serious. The violence of the evening had stripped away all artifice, all his carefully constructed defenses. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of his feelings. "Clara," he began, his voice low and earnest. "Why set out there? I meant every word. I have been living in a ghost story of my own, making for 5 years. I thought solitude was strength, but it was just a long, slow death. You brought this place, you brought me back to life." He reached into the pocket of his worn coat. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring. It was a simple band, engraved with delicate, faded vines. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me to give to Anna." He paused, the memory a shadow that no longer had the power to plunge him into darkness. It was just a part of his story, the preface to this new chapter. "It represents a promise," he continued, his gaze holding hers. "A promise of a shared life, of building something together that can withstand the storms. I know I have no right to ask you. I know I am a difficult, broken man. But I will spend the rest of my days trying to be the man you deserve. Clara May Thompson, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here?" Clara's heart felt as if it would burst. This man, who had been a fortress of solitude, was offering her his whole world, his past, and his future. He was not broken. He was healing. And she was a part of that healing, just as he was a part of hers. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happy tears. "Oh, Ethan, yes." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, transforming his rugged features, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was devastatingly beautiful. He took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. From the kitchen, Martha watched them, a rare, soft smile on her own face. She quietly placed 3 cups on the table instead of 2. The house was no longer a place of solitude. It was a home. Word of the shootout and Ethan Blackwood's impending marriage spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. The town, which had once gossiped about the mail-order bride and the reclusive rancher, now saw them as heroes. Corbin was arrested by the territorial marshal without a fight, his empire of greed crumbling overnight. Silas Croft, stripped of his powerful patron, faded into insignificance, eventually leaving town on a freight wagon, an object of pity and scorn. The community, which Ethan had held at arm's length for so long, rallied around them. The men from town rode out to the ranch on a Saturday, and in a single day of shared labor and good-natured noise, they repaired the barn stronger and better than before. The women brought pies and bread, fussing over Clara, their initial suspicion replaced by a warm, welcoming acceptance. They saw the strength in her, the same strength Ethan had seen. She was not a fragile Easterner. She was one of them now. Their wedding was a simple ceremony held on the porch of the ranch house as the wildflowers bloomed in the valley. Sheriff Brody officiated, and the entire town seemed to be in attendance. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress that Martha had helped her sew, and in her hair, she wore a crown of the same blue wildflowers that grew near the creek. Ethan stood beside her, his usual stern expression replaced by a quiet, constant joy. He looked at her as if she were the sun, and he had spent his whole life in darkness. As they said their vows, with the mountains as their witness and the community as their family, Ethan took her hand. He looked from a ring on her finger to her radiant face, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was finally home. The ghosts were at peace, not gone, but integrated into a life that was once again full of light and love and the promise of tomorrow. 2 years later, the sun, a benevolent gold, spilled over the valley, illuminating a scene of profound and peaceful domesticity. The Blackwood Ranch was thriving. The herd had grown, the fences were strong, and a new wing had been added to the log house, its fresh-cut pine a testament to growth and a future built with shared hands. On the porch, a small boy of about 1.5 years, with his father's serious gray eyes and a shock of dark hair, was trying with great determination to stack 2 wooden blocks. He babbled with frustration when they tumbled, a sound of pure, childish life that echoed in the quiet morning air. Clara sat in a sturdy rocking chair, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. She was pregnant with her second child. She watched her son, Jacob, named for the brother he would never know, a tribute to the past that was now a foundation, not a tomb, and a gentle smile touched her lips. The library books she had once clung to for escape now sat on shelves next to Ethan's ledgers and books on animal husbandry. Her world had expanded in ways she could never have imagined. She was no longer a fish out of water, but a woman deeply rooted in the soil of her chosen home. The sound of hoofbeats announced Ethan's return from the north pasture. He rode Ajax into the yard, swinging down from the saddle with the same easy grace she had first noticed on that dusty street in Redemption Gulch. But the man who walked toward her now was not the same one. The guarded tension was gone from his shoulders, the harsh lines around his eyes had softened, and the sorrow had been replaced by a deep, abiding peace. He came up the porch steps, his boots making a solid, comforting sound. He bent down and kissed her, a slow, familiar kiss full of unspoken affection. Then he scooped up their son, tossing him into the air, eliciting a squeal of pure delight. "He's going to be a builder, this one," Ethan said, his voice rumbling with laughter as he settled the boy on his hip. "He gets his stubbornness from his father," Clara replied, her eyes twinkling. Ethan sat on the porch rail. Facing her, their son nestled securely in his arm. He looked at his wife, at the new life she carried, at the son they had created, at the home they had built and defended together. His heart was so full it felt like a physical presence in his chest. "I was thinking this morning," he said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the mountains. "About that day I rode away. I was so sure that being alone was the only way to be safe." He looked back at her, his love for her shining in his eyes, open and unashamed. "I have never been safer or stronger than I am right here with you." Clara reached out and placed her hand on his, her simple silver ring glinting in the sun. "You were never alone, Ethan," she said softly. "You were just waiting, and I was coming to find you." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. He looked at his family, at the peaceful, sprawling land that was their kingdom, and he knew her words were the truest thing in the world. He had found his home, not in the solitude of the wilderness, but in the shelter of her love, and he would never ride away again.